Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for being here for our last keynote of the day. Let's welcome on stage Luís Pollo from Netflix.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you for being here. Have you ever wondered if a big software company or a software organization can stay scrappy and innovate quickly? Can they? They can, but it's not the norm. At Netflix, we continue to do that despite having grown to several thousand employees. For example, we were able to launch our very first live streaming event in about 6 months. That was a massive technical undertaking that required coordination across all of engineering, and we were able to pull that off by staying nimble and agile. What's the secret? Great engineers, a great engineering culture, and our developer platform. This is how we're able to accelerate developer productivity, and that's what we're going to talk about today. Good afternoon, boa tarde para quem fala português. My name is Luís Pollo, and I'm a senior software engineer at Netflix. I work in the developer productivity team there, and I've been at Netflix a little over 5 years now. I know I don't look the part, so to speak, but I'm originally from Brazil. I moved to the US in 2014, and today I'm really honored to be here in Lisbon to share a bit of my work experience with you. I wanted to thank the SINFO organization for the invitation and give a special shout out to André for finding me almost by accident and organizing everything so I could be here today. Thank you so much. I've been involved in software development in one role or another for over 20 years now. As time went on, I found that my passion was really in helping other developers be as productive as possible, which is why I love being part of developer productivity, and I'm always happy to talk about it. So, what are we going to cover in this talk? You had two amazing talks before mine today about careers, so I decided to try something different and leave the part where I tell you about how I got here to the end of this talk. I'm hoping that that keeps things interesting. We'll start by talking a little bit about DevOps and how that fits into the Netflix engineering culture. Next, we'll talk about the challenges of scaling this approach, which is where the idea of platform engineering comes in. And we'll touch on the concept of the paved road that was pioneered by Netflix. Then we'll talk about some challenges and opportunities in this space, and we'll wrap with a little detour to talk about my professional journey, and we'll end with some takeaways. We should have time for Q&A at the end. Before we dive in, though, let me tell you a little bit about Netflix and our engineering organization. I guess it's safe to assume that everyone here knows what Netflix is, right? We are the leading streaming service globally, and our mission is to entertain the world one fan at a time. We currently reach over 500 million people in more than 190 countries and 50 languages, which is pretty remarkable. That's a lot of people in a lot of places with all kinds of different cultures and preferences for entertainment. But obviously, we were not that big when we started. I know that there's a lot of young people in the audience today, so just in case you didn't know, the way that Netflix started almost 30 years ago was as a DVD by mail business. They used to come in these little red envelopes back in the day. That was very low tech in comparison, but it was a long time ago. These days, though, we're not even limiting ourselves to video on demand anymore. We're constantly looking for new ways and exciting ways to entertain. The most prominent examples recently are games and live streaming. So who knows what the future will bring? This means we need to be able to stay agile and have the ability to try new things quickly. Which brings us to Netflix engineering. How do we fit into the picture? Even though we're still thought of as a tech company, Netflix is a media and entertainment company. This means that engineering is a supporting function for the business like many other companies. That said, engineering is still a pretty sizable part of Netflix because technology enables all parts of our business. We have a lot of different engineering functions, from supporting the production of shows in our studio, to preparing content to stream on the platform, to recommending the best shows for you to watch, to streaming, to games, and much more. All these areas of engineering work require a lot of engineers, so we have a few thousands of those. And all these people need building blocks and tools to focus on solving business problems, which is where our developer platform comes in. I like to think of developing software as building a house. Without a solid foundation, you can't build a house. Also, you wouldn't want to reinvent solutions for the same technical problems over and over. So that means we need some common building blocks. So you can think of the platform as the foundation of the house. And you might even hear developers complaining about having to deal with the plumbing, those common things that every house needs to have. This works with the analogy too. And if you were wondering where I fit into all this, I'm making my small contribution over here somewhere. Okay, now that I've given you a brief overview of how engineering is organized at Netflix, let's take a step back and talk about some principles underpinning what we do, our culture, and why those things matter in how we enable our developers to be very productive. Then we'll circle back to this idea of platform engineering and get into more detail. Okay, the first concept I wanted to talk about is DevOps. It was funny when André reached out to me to ask if I wanted to do a talk because he asked if I wanted to talk about how we do DevOps at Netflix. And the funny thing is, we don't use that term at Netflix. It's just very ingrained in the way that we do work, but we just never adopted the term. But what does it mean anyway? DevOps is short for development plus operations, very simple. The original idea was this set of practices to integrate the processes of software development and IT operations, but as we'll see in a bit, it has evolved to encompass much more. The ideas that led to DevOps as a movement, so to speak, started to crystallize around 2008, and the term itself was coined by this guy named Patrick Debois, who was a systems administrator from Belgium back in 2009, kind of by accident. He was frustrated by the conflicts between software developers and IT admins, and so he decided to put together a conference to talk about it, and he called it DevOps Days, just because Agile Systems Administration was too long. And after the conference, the hashtag DevOps started trending on Twitter, and the rest is history. As you read about DevOps, you'll inevitably come across some variation of this infinite loop diagram. This is where it starts to get more interesting. The general idea of the diagram is to illustrate the various steps that make up the software development lifecycle once you adopt DevOps. The most important thing for me about the diagram is that there are no silos. You don't see any team names on here, just a continuous cycle of steps that connect and feed into each other. I also like this version of the diagram from Atlassian because it has collaboration and communication running through the entire cycle, which is really key. Without collaboration and communication, the rest doesn't really work. I would add the word automation running throughout as well because that's another core principle. What people realized was that having silos for each of these parts of the software development lifecycle was not very efficient. It was like a game of hot potato, where you take care of only a very specialized set of tasks and then toss the software over to the next team to handle. So Dev might toss the hot potato over to QA, and then QA might toss the hot potato over to Ops. And by the time it gets to our ops engineer there, he's really sad because he has no agency in improving the software. Basically, this approach creates the wrong incentives. For example, if the developers are not involved in operating their systems in production, they don't really have an incentive to know if the number of servers that are running the application are enough, or if the size of the database is right, or whatever, right? Which is pretty crazy if you think about it. And then if you look at the picture from the other end there and think of the ops engineer, they might be the first one to get paged if there's a production incident, for example, but they're not writing the code, so they're not really in a position to troubleshoot, which is why these silos don't really make a lot of sense. Going back to our diagram, the last thing I'll point out is that dev and ops actually encompasses a lot of things like I mentioned. It has things like testing, planning, and gathering feedback from the system and your users, which is the perfect segue to talk about the Netflix engineering culture. So what's so different about our culture? At Netflix, with very few exceptions, we don't have separate teams for things like QA and operations. This is not necessarily unique to Netflix, but also definitely not the norm, especially among big companies, I'd say. Historically, we also didn't have people with specialized roles for product design and planning, which meant that our developers had to wear those hats as well. And that's why we call them full cycle developers. A lot of the engineering culture is a direct reflection of the broader company culture at Netflix, such as the idea of the dream team and the concept of people over process. Basically, what we try to do is hire the best people for the job and then get out of their way so they can do their best work. This is codified in some of these principles here, like context not control, or highly aligned and loosely coupled. We share information pretty openly within the company. So for example, as an engineer, even though I don't really have a need to, I have access to most of the documents, including sensitive confidential plans for new shows, for instance. And this only works, obviously, if you have what we call unusually responsible people. The same is true of our engineering org as well. So we share enough context so that anyone can do their job and then try to get out of their way. Or I should say we try to pave the way so that they can move fast. Which takes me back to our full cycle developers. You might be asking yourself, how can a developer cover all of these different areas and do those things really well? The answer is pretty simple. They can't. There's just not enough time or brain space, frankly, for an engineer to become really proficient in all the dozens of tools and technologies that are required to build these modern systems in the cloud, let alone also take on the roles of product design and planning. It would be totally overwhelming to even try. Of course, we don't want our developers to feel like this, which is where the idea of platform teams and platform engineering comes in. So let's have a look at that. The trick is to have a set of small, centralized teams whose only job is to be the specialist for all of these DevOps tools. We call these platform teams. They provide the common building blocks that other engineering teams can use. Or to use an analogy from the beginning of the talk, they provide the foundation of the house. By the way, I thought I mentioned this book called Team Topologies, and I believe Manuel is from Lisbon. These guys have been studying and teaching about how to better organize teams in technology companies for years now. And in the book, they talk about Conway's Law, which you may have heard about. This is one of those things that just stuck in the common culture of tech companies, but it was written way back in 1967 by this programmer called Melvin Conway. And basically what it says is that the systems that our organizations design tend to end up having more or less the shape of our org charts. And it's pretty remarkable if you've been around long enough how this tends to be true. Anyway, the authors of the book argue, and I agree, that because of this tendency, we need to be smart about how we organize our teams such that the systems that they produce will make more sense and that they will reduce cognitive load for all the people involved. The book proposes this notion of 4 basic types of teams, one of which is platform teams. So how does this connect with DevOps? Well, the domains that platform teams address in a software engineering organization kind of is exactly the kind of things that you would think about when you talk about DevOps. Here's just a handful of examples, but it's a forever growing list of things, which is another good reason to have specialized teams taking care of all this. I'll talk a little more about my team later, but currently I'm in change automation at Netflix. Of course, having dedicated teams and all the tools in the world won't help if your developers can't find them or use them, which is why the key ingredient is to treat your developer tools like products. This means that you give it the same level of attention to detail and care as you would to a product that you're selling to your customers. The top 3 things that come to mind for me when I think about great developer tools are first, a great user experience that's self-service, which means that your developers don't have to ask a bunch of questions to figure out how to use your tools. Then excellent documentation, because first they need to be able to find your tools and understand if they're the right ones for the job. And then for anything that they can't self-service via the experience, they need to be able to answer those questions. And last but not least, you need to be able to provide professional-grade support for your tools, which includes things like setting expectations for when you're available to answer questions, via what channels, how long people should wait to receive an answer, and so on. If you do all these things, then hopefully the experience for a developer trying to get something done goes from that overwhelmed feeling to something a little bit more like this. All right. We talked about DevOps evolving into platform engineering, but there's one more concept that I wanted to talk about, and that's the concept of the paved road. To the best of my knowledge, this concept was pioneered by Netflix, but we're definitely not the only company using it. The paved road is not a thing per se. It's a concept, and it's pretty straightforward, really. It's a set of standard tools, processes, and best practices that engineers can use to streamline their work. And the analogy comes from this idea that as you're trying to get from point A to point B, if you have a paved path, it's much faster and safer to get there. You don't have to guess the way or think too much about how to navigate. You just follow the road and the signs, and you'll get there safely. Even better if the road is a straight line, like in the slide there. We tend to use big words like opinionated and curated to describe the paved road, but all that really means is that someone put a lot of thought into picking the best pieces to solve the puzzle, which, as we talked about, is the job of platform teams. So how about going off the paved road, though? As an engineer, can you do that? The short answer is yes, you can, but it may not be a very smooth ride. For example, the road may be unknown or scary, or there may be potholes. You might run into some unexpected creatures along the way, or who knows, you may get totally stuck in the end. So while engineers at Netflix are given the freedom to deviate from the paved road, they're highly encouraged not to do so, because once they do, then that means they're on their own, having to take care of all those things that normally the platform would do for them. This is a good segue to talk about challenges and opportunities. Is it all rainbows and unicorns? Of course not. Let me talk about some of the challenges that I've observed at Netflix and in the industry, and what we're doing to improve. The first challenge I would call out is having too many options for doing the same thing. Going back to this idea of reducing cognitive load that I talked about, anytime you offer developers multiple ways of solving the same problem, you're forcing them to make an unnecessary choice. And this adds to their cognitive load and also distracts them from their main job. As an example, to illustrate how this can get to an extreme, I put this on the slide here, and this is the cloud native landscape from the Cloud Native Foundation website, which you might be familiar with. You're only getting the prize for the talk today if you can read this slide here, by the way. No, I'm just kidding. This is pretty mind-blowing, right? When I put this slide together, I counted almost 900 projects and tools on this page. There's just no way that anyone can know all those things. Even if you zoom into one single category on that page, like continuous integration and delivery, there's still a lot of tools to pick from. Some of these might be building blocks that you can put together, like Jenkins for CI builds or Spinnaker for continuous delivery pipelines, but others are competitors in the same space, like Flux and Argo at the top there for deployments in Kubernetes environments, for instance. So with all these options, how do you pick the quote-unquote right tools for your team or company? It's tricky. This problem happens at a smaller scale at Netflix too. Historically, we've given a lot of freedom for folks to go and build things, and they did, including within platform engineering, which at times meant that we ended up with some conflicting options for doing the same thing as well. So even if you have dedicated platform teams managing the paved road, you have to make an intentional effort to keep the list in check so it doesn't grow into too many or competing options. So what are we doing to improve? The first thing we did a few years ago was to introduce a product function within platform engineering. There's two main reasons for this. The first is that product design and planning is a world in itself that requires a specific skill set. And even though I mentioned our full cycle developers tended to use that hat sometimes, and we still do, because there's not enough coverage of product management for the entire engineering org, that's never really our core skill set. So it really helps to have people whose only job is to focus on taking care of that part of the problem. And then the second thing is that we continue to have all of these small independent teams working on different platform engineering domains, which means that there will always be some level of separation. So it also really helps to have someone help looking at the big picture and making sure that the things connect and work well together, that they fit into a larger story. The second challenge is having disjointed experiences across your developer tools. This is not a surprising result at all if you think about that slide with like a bazillion options for doing things, right? Unless you make a concerted effort to make that better, the default state is to have disjointed experiences where the best you can do is to click from one tool to the next. So for instance, you might start at GitHub with a pull request that you merge, and then from there you click a link to get to your build in Jenkins, and another one to go see your deployment in Spinnaker, for instance. And then after the software is deployed, if there's something you want to troubleshoot in production, you might click another link to go see the application logs. So again, it's not that you can't get the job done, but it's just so much context switching with all these browser windows while keeping all that mental picture in your head. So to address this challenge, what we're doing is to invest in creating a new developer portal that we call Netflix Console. And the goal for this is to be a one-stop shop for most of your needs as a software developer. As you can hopefully see on the slide on the left there, we have navigation items on this portal going all the way from your source code functions like pull requests to observing the health of your system in production. Everything in one experience. Of course, we're still migrating all those tools from years ago onto the new portal, and that will take time, but we're seeing strong adoption and starting to reap the benefits of having this unified experience. The last challenge I would highlight is how to improve at scale. Once you have a tool that's being used by thousands of engineers, and the tool provides different ways of performing a certain task, how do you improve the task itself so that everyone can benefit? The screenshots on this slide are probably hard to read, but I just wanted to give you a concrete example of how this has manifested at Netflix. These are all Spinnaker pipelines, which are still the primary way by which we get code deployed to production. Every single one of these pipelines is doing conceptually the exact same thing, which is to deploy a build to production safely. But as you can tell by the screenshots, they each go about it in a very different way. This makes it nearly impossible for a platform team to now come up with a better answer to this question of how do we deploy a build safely to production. The takeaway is that the lack of higher level abstractions makes improving at scale really difficult. To address this problem, we've been investing more and more into abstractions. An example here is a new type of continuous delivery system that we built on top of Spinnaker that we call managed delivery. This approach abstracts away the details of how your builds get deployed. Instead, you define these logical environments like test and prod in this screenshot, and Spinnaker figures out when there's a new build to deploy and how to get it deployed to production safely. A related improvement that's near and dear to my heart because it's driven by my team is automating change at scale. In the last couple of years, we've introduced a new platform for what we call change campaigns. These campaigns provide a way for those platform teams to target the software of other teams in the company and track the progress of a change that they want to make to those other pieces of software. A lot of these campaigns are still manual, but my team is working really hard so that in the future, the majority of these campaigns could be automated. So if you're on the receiving end, you shouldn't have to do any manual steps. For example, you might think that the next time we have a big security incident like that log4j one a little while ago, that we might be able to push out a change to fix that problem to the vast majority of our services, which will be a major improvement. Okay, it's 2025, and I know I can't do a talk at a tech conference without mentioning AI, so let me check that little box. Like everyone else, I've watched in awe as AI has taken off in the last couple of years, and at Netflix, we've been using it in platform engineering with pretty good results. But it's not a panacea, at least not yet. There's a few areas that I would highlight when it's been really helpful for us. The first is co-pilots, which is probably what you're most familiar with. So You can use it as a programming buddy, essentially, that's infinitely patient. You can ask it a million questions. It will answer you every time. It's really good at writing tests for you, helping you figure out if there's bugs in your code, things like that. So that's definitely the primary use case. Another one is augmented search. So at Netflix, we're very big on internal documentation to the point where it can quickly get overwhelming to try and find the right docs. And so what we've done is to throw all of our internal information systems at generative AI, and now it can not only search through that trove of information, but give you a summarized answer, which is very, very helpful. I've been using the new search pretty much daily ever since it came out. The next one is log and failure analysis, which is another case of finding the needle in the haystack. So, for instance, we have bots right now that will post in your pull requests to tell you exactly what happened in a failed build, for instance. If you have an open pull request and the build failed, it would analyze the logs and tell you why the build failed. And then lastly, the one area that we're still working on is user support. So similar to that idea of giving AI that trove of internal information so it can help give you better answers, you might imagine that we could use AI bots to at least provide the first line of support for your users. Is it going to take away all of our jobs, though? Maybe, but I think it's going to take a little while. First of all those soft skills that you heard in the previous talk are still very human, right? It takes people to understand how complex systems integrate, to collaborate across teams, to make strategic decisions. All those are things that AI cannot substitute today: creativity, judgment, or interpersonal communication. Also, until all existing software out there can be understood by AI agents and maintained, there's a lot of legacy code out there that will require humans to maintain. That said, I would say that AI literacy is already table stakes at this point. So it's just another tool that you need to have in your toolkit. All right, we're almost done. But before we wrap, I now wanted to take that detour to tell you a little bit about how I ended up here, and then we'll close with some takeaways. But why should you care about my career anyway? My hope is to get at least some of you interested in this space of developer productivity, because there's definitely opportunities in it. And as you can tell, I'm very passionate about it. Also to show you that there's many possible paths for you to grow as a software engineer. I mentioned I moved from Brazil to the US in 2014, right? So my story begins there. Any Brazilians in the house? Yeah? Amazing. Great. I was born in the countryside of Rio Grande do Sul, which is the southernmost state in Brazil, and went to school in the 1990s, also known as a very long time ago, probably before a lot of you were born, at the Federal University of Santa Maria for a bachelor's in computer science. Very early on, I fell in love with coding. I think I've always been drawn, especially to the creative aspects of it. At this point, though, my story takes a detour. After I graduated, I had this incredible opportunity to do an 18-month internship in the Atlanta metro area with a company called SpaceNet, which at the time was a small subsidiary of GE, and they did satellite telecommunications. This experience truly changed my life. I would encourage any of you who are still in school or just getting out of school to seek out an opportunity to travel, see the world, and experience other cultures different than your own. It's definitely worth it. For me, this was a watershed moment. Remember, I come from this small town in the countryside of Brazil. I'm living in this big city for the first time, speaking a different language, interacting with people from all over the world. It was a massive change. I made friends during this period that I've kept my whole life. Also, here you can see what I looked like when I was your age. You know, a lot more hair, fewer kilos, but still going. Back from my detour of a year and a half, I went back to Brazil and completed a master's degree at the Federal University of Rio Grande do Sul in the early 2000s. Right after that, I decided to move all the way up to Salvador in the state of Bahia, where I officially started my career as a software engineer. Fun fact for the Portuguese is that, we probably know this, that Bahia is the state where the Portuguese first landed in Brazil. Anyway, the real reason I moved there, though, was not for work, but was for love. and this eventually led to my beautiful family. And funny enough, I got a pass this time because tomorrow is my 20th wedding anniversary. So, thank you very much. Thank you. All right, after I got married, we moved back to the south and I got a job at HP. I'm guessing you've all seen HP printers around, at least, right? HP is actually a huge company that builds a bunch of different products, and this job was a great opportunity because we had a research and development center there in one of the local universities, and with that we were able to work with all the different business units of the company and in a variety of different projects. So during the 8 years that I was there, I had the opportunity to work on things that were as low level as firmware for storage arrays, all the way to web applications and everything in between. It was a very rich experience. Anyway, during this period is when the idea of the cloud first became a thing, and we started applying some of those DevOps principles we talked about. This period is also when some of these household names like AWS and Google Cloud started to establish themselves in the infrastructure as a service space, and also companies like Heroku in the platform as a service space. I wanted to mention this because I've been kind of obsessed with this idea of platform as a service ever since. And if you're not familiar, platform as a service in a nutshell basically means that as a developer, you focus on pushing code to your Git repository, and the platform takes care of figuring out how to build it and deploy it for you. Similar to that idea of managed delivery we talked about. This idea would drive my career to where I am at today, actually. This is how I ended up at Netflix. At this point, all of our server-side software went cloud native, and so I started to naturally gravitate more towards DevOps more seriously. And at one point, I realized that I enjoyed working on the developer tooling and the DevOps stuff more than I did on the products, and so I made an official transition into that space. While I was in Houston, we created a special interest group for DevOps across the company with people from all over, which was a lot of fun. And during this period, this group created HP's first version of their paved road, which we called HP Codeway. This was hugely influenced by the Netflix concept of the paved road. During this time, I used to attend software conferences and kind of dream about working at Netflix one day. I never thought that that would happen until in the summer of 2019, I got this email from a recruiter out of the blue, and off we went to the Bay Area in California. So, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've been there for a little over 5 years now. I started on the Spinnaker, the delivery engineering team, which takes care of Spinnaker and that managed delivery abstraction I talked to you about before. And lately, I've been working in change automation on the campaigns platform I also showed you. So my customers kind of shifted from the application developers to these other platform teams that are trying to push out change to all the other engineering teams at Netflix. All in all, I'd say it's been a very exciting adventure so far, but I'm not done yet. All right, let's talk about some takeaways, and then we'll have Q&A. Everyone still awake? All right, great. What have I learned? Here are some takeaways. First, in platform engineering and developer productivity. You don't really need a platform team on day one, especially if your team or company is really small. But I'd say you can apply those DevOps principles on day one, so you can avoid silos, you can collaborate more. The next one is to treat your developer tools like products. It's hard to overstate the importance of this one, and the longer you wait to do this, the harder it gets. So even if you're starting really small, I would encourage you to always give a lot of care and attention to your user documentation and the user experience as well. And then third is abstractions, right? We talked about that before. Provide abstractions and enforce standards so you can evolve the implementation of your tools as you go. Again, once your tools are out in the wild and being used by a lot of people, it's really hard to change them unless you provide these abstractions. As for my journey, as I was just saying, sometimes I still pinch myself to check if it's all true. How did I end up at Netflix? And so if I could make it, you can make it. So dream big. I would say if you watched the talk by Ivo before, my journey was definitely different than his. Took a lot longer, as you saw, right? So that just goes to show that there's a lot of possible paths for you to get there. As for working in developer productivity, I've always found it super rewarding to help other developers be most productive. And while that's the case, I think you can also argue that it's not as glamorous as working on end user products, right? Because this work kind of happens behind the curtains. At the same time, because we tend to run these lean and scrappy teams, I would say there's a little more job safety in this area. Finally, it's a fast-moving domain, so you're never short of new things to learn, and there's always a lot of room for innovation and interesting challenges as well. And that's all I had. Thank you very much for coming. I hope this was interesting and useful to you, and that some of you will take an interest in developer and productivity.
Thank you very much for your keynote. Now let's give some. We have some time for Q&A. Any questions?
Okay.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
You talked a little bit in the beginning about how difficult it can be for big companies to incorporate the platforms that they already had that weren't integrated, and how companies that aren't as old can, from the beginning, from startups, if they have this in mind, they can start to incorporate it even if they don't have a team dedicated to it.
Mm-hmm.
My question is, if you had the job to change the workflow of a dev team of a really big company that
Mm-hmm.
is like set in their ways and don't operate like this, we know that many times they try to hire consulting companies to help them innovate and integrate more productive workflows,
Mm-hmm.
but that doesn't work because the habits are too sticky. So I would like to ask you how you would go over it.
Man, that's a good question. Difficult one too. So I actually lived through a similar experience when I was at HP during my career there, because again, HP was a massive company. At one point, we were over 300,000 people, so much, much bigger than Netflix, for example. And just like you described, right, everyone very set in their ways, and we tended to bring in a lot of consultants when things didn't go right, expecting that someone would magically come in and fix the problems. But to your point, it's really hard to change those habits that are very ingrained. So I think my short answer is that there is no magic, really. It is a really tricky problem. What I saw in my team is that, and actually this connects back to the previous talk on those soft skills and growing in your software engineering career, is that you need to do a lot of internal kind of politics, for lack of a better word, sell the ideas to your managers, especially to your leadership team, about why these things can make things more efficient, right? Especially if you can kind of demonstrate to them that in the end that will give them a return in terms of money. That's the key, in my opinion. I mentioned that at the time we used to go to some of these software conferences and hear about what other younger companies like Netflix were doing. And so one thing I would do coming back to the big company was to do a presentation to them, like a sales pitch, and say, hey, we saw about all of these amazing things that these companies are doing. How about we try that? And slowly but surely, chipping away at it, slowly we ended up kind of selling the pitch to our management and created a function within our team to kind of start working in this new way and also teach our developers to work in this new way. It takes time, though. Does that answer the question?
Yes. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Any other?
Boa tarde.
Boa tarde.
Parabéns pela apresentação e pelo aniversário.
Obrigado.
Queria perguntar, você disse que ama programar e eu queria saber se no seu cargo hoje você ainda programa ou se já é algo mais técnico. Não, algo menos técnico. Algo mais de gerência, assim.
Okay, should I repeat the question in English just in case? So, just in case, the question was if in my job today I still get to do coding or if it's mostly non-coding related tasks. And I'm happy to report that I still do a lot of coding. Actually, I would say the majority of my time is spent on technical tasks these days. I think what's different about Netflix, like I showed you in that picture with the full cycle developers, is that we also wear these other hats from time to time. So we are involved in the full cycle of developing new tools and systems from the very early stages of doing requirements gathering with our users, user interviews. Sometimes we even dabble on UX design because we don't always necessarily have UX designers available within our teams, all the way up to actually implementing the software and then operating it in production, which is just as much work as it sounds. So it's a lot. But yes, I get to still do that. I think one thing I should say is that Netflix did not have levels, engineering levels, like the ones that Ivo talked about before. When I joined 5 years ago, everyone was a senior software engineer. So when I joined, people had different salaries, but everyone was a senior software engineer. And so we all wore these different hats at different times depending on what the need was in the team and the products that we were working on. Now, I think after my second year there, they did introduce levels. And now we started hiring even like more junior engineers, and they also introduced the higher levels that would match to staff and principal, like Ivo was talking about. So at that level, the story changes a little, just like he was explaining if you saw that talk. At my level, I'm still a senior. I still get to do a lot of coding. But even the people that are at the highest level, I still see them doing pull requests from time to time, so I think they still get to do some coding.
Obrigado.
Boa
Boa tarde.
Any other questions?
Okay. You told us about how you advance productivity in the programmers on a company, but if you had to do it for yourself, how would you do so?
Can you expand a little bit on the question? Like, what do you mean yourself? Because you're generally not working by yourself, right? Do you mean as in an open source project?
Yeah, no,
or?
I mean like you try to teach others how to be more productive, but how do you teach yourself?
Oh, I see what you mean. That's a good question. Again, it goes back to that. If you haven't, I hope you watched Ivo's talk because it was a great one. If you haven't, I would encourage you to do so because he talked a lot about the importance of these soft skills, right? And one of them was time management. Because honestly, execution is kind of table stakes, especially at a top tier company like Netflix, for example. They will only hire you if they believe that you are ready to hit the ground running and execute. So there's never a question as to whether that's a skill that you have. Now, those other things, obviously, you can continue to grow in your career. And I would say time management is kind of on the boundary of execution and soft skills. And so, yeah, I mean, it's a constant learning curve, I'd say. I still feel like I'm learning and growing every day. And even though, it's because I've been around so long, I found kind of a groove that works well for me in how I divide up my time, how I try to minimize distractions, for example, with meetings and stuff like that. There is always room to improve. And I will tell you that within our teams at Netflix, all of the teams, all of the leadership is also constantly looking for ways to reduce the distraction for everyone. So that tells you that it's not like a me problem or a you problem. It's really like an organizational problem because we need to work together. A lot of people are remote. We need to have meetings. We need to coordinate. And so a lot of that stuff is going to cause distractions. But each of us needs to find their own groove, so to speak, to find ways that work well for them.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Okay, unfortunately, we're running out of time, so I'll ask anyone with further questions to go to the second stage, where we'll host the remaining Q&A. And yeah, let's give a round of applause to Luís again.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
And we'll also give the prize for the session. Sofia Bonifácio. This was our last keynote of the day. I'll invite everyone to go to the workshops in a bit, and no enrollment is required this year, so you just need to show up in the rooms. Thank you.